Cool. So, let's jump into product first. I read a decent amount of the public-facing materials, testimonials, case studies, Quora, responses and things like that. And one of the first things I'd like to understand about the product is I understand the use cases, but I'd like to understand better the humans that are touching it and the frequency with which they're touching it. And so, the first way to understand is for Palantir's customers, who is it within the government or within the energy organizations that are actually interfacing with the tools and or any people on Palantir's team? And what is the frequency with which they're actually going into these programs and using it for something?
Yes. Great question. And I'd say this is going to be true for many of the questions you asked. There are sort of two very different answers for the government versus non-government. And so, when I say government, what that means in practice is Palantir Gotham. And it is sort of the thing, that was the product that sort of Palantir was founded on. And that product is very specific, very specifically designed, right? The way I describe it is kind of like a really helpful tool for supporting like hardcore investigatory workflows, right? So I can imagine you're a CIA analyst or whatever, and you're trying to like uncover some like money laundering ring, international money laundering ring, right? And you've got highly heterogeneous data sets from phone logs to financial transactions, to emails, to whatever it is, right? The way it used to work, right, is you have like a hunch. You'd like to have to sort of troll through a database and maybe use some SQL. Maybe you didn't, or maybe you asked somebody to do it. And this was like very sort of time-consuming process to stitch stuff together. And the intent behind Gotham as a product is to allow these like very knowledgeable, talented analysts to like move through and find patterns in data even if they weren't super technical, right? So in that sort of an overly simplified summary perhaps. But what it means in practice is that Gotham is a really good product for many investigatory workflows, right? Where like the user is like the DOJ or whatever, right? Like it doesn't have to be. I think a lot of times, people think about Palantir as being the secret organization, that government work must be three-letter agencies. But anywhere where you've got like these complicated investigations going on, it can be like quite a helpful tool.
So is the product pricing on a per-seat basis? And then how many of these analysts, if you take one organization, you don't have to name the organization, but take one government organization, how many individuals have a seat? And are they using it for the 3 months they're investigating XYZ campaign? Or is this something that they're logging into every day at their jobs throughout the course of the year?
Yes. I mean, there's two parts there, right? One was the sort of pricing, and one was the usage stuff. I think on the pricing side, I think that has evolved and changed over time. And to be honest, I haven't taken a gander at it lately. But much of it is actually public knowledge, right? Because it's sort of government contracts. But it typically does involve some buy seat and some fixed, and these government contracts tend to be like pretty busy, complicated things for what it's worth. And I mean, not that you've asked this question, but I think one thing that Palantir, I think, does pretty well and better than most of Silicon Valley is it just has the patience for government procurement, which I assure you, it's like no joke. It's like really hard. And it's not easy to copy, right? It's not like, oh, now I've got 100 really good software engineers we're going to build. You don't think about procurement often, but it's like just the ability to deal with procurement, but it's a big deal. Anyway, so I digressed. I think the second part of your question in terms of like how much do people use it, that too, of course, varies. But it's not uncommon. I don't think this is like giving any way to suggest that like the people who use it a lot, right? I think maybe Bloomberg terminal is probably an overstatement. And again, and pardon me, I don't want to maybe get to the specifics, but it's sort of like there's a lot of investigators find it super useful and use it a lot. So that was the government side. I'll pause there. Does that sound good?
Yes, that's fine. That's fine, I think, yes. Let's jump to non-government.
Yes. So in the commercial space, the sort of primary product platform is called Foundry. And it's quite a different beast. And the way I've sort of tried to characterize, it's hard to characterize it in a way that doesn't sound like sort of like general fluff, but this is an ambitious product. But the intent is to be a sort of a data platform that is like the single source of truth for organizations and sort of like supporting decisions. So okay, that's unicorns and so on, right?
I actually understand the purpose of Foundry. It's the more you can put it into competitive positioning because you have Workday that's built around the human capital management. You have Salesforce that's built around your sales side. For Foundry, I'm having a hard time positioning Foundry within these other platforms that have owned these other verticals.
Yes. No, totally. And I'd say it's interesting in terms of, I'm answering your question with a narrative, but bear with me, right, like often, where you start defines a lot of how the product grows, right? So to your point, right, like Workday started with like, okay, let's like do human capital management, and let's like really nail payroll and stuff, right? And they sort of grew from there. Salesforce like CRM, obviously, they started there and tried to generalize. And then you look at a player like Amazon, AWS, right? They're kind of like growing up from the bottom. They're like we start with like something slightly above bare iron, and you just like going up in the stack, right? Until you're like developing analytic tools, right? Rather than starting with like business users. I think like Foundry evolved in the context of just like trying to solve problems with customers, right? Like in the very early days of the commercial, in terms of like front-end product, there wasn't very much. Like what was being done was to sort of help with sort of more back-end stuff. And I think like the pattern that emerges is that most businesses, the primary problem they're trying to solve is like massive heterogeneity in terms of like the data that's interesting and useful to them. And so, like the data integration thing is actually the hard part, right? Like it's not a pretty graph. It's not the dashboard. It's like the completely unsexy plumbing of like, well, this data comes from over here, and it's an append job, but that one's batch and blah, blah, blah. Or snapshots, and just like how do you manage the orchestration of moving all this data around in a way that just works and is flexible and you can change as the world around you changes.
So, are you positioning it as a modern ETL competitor, or going after Informatica and stuff?
It definitely does that, right? But again, this is sort of like where does it start and where does it go, right? So I think that's kind of like its starting point was like, wow, ETL is really hard to do at scale. But it sort of grew from that, and I'd say now it aspires to be like much broader than that. And so I'm sure that continues to grow, and there are public demos, right? So again, this is not anything that isn't publicly accessible. But I think the platform is already at the stage now where they aspire to pull in users of all types, right? So it's like there's the tooling to help hardcore data engineers manage hundreds of data pipelines with hundreds of very complicated build graphs, right? Like where you've got hundreds of different data sources, and they all have to be like created in a certain order. And there's way too much complexity to manage in the human head, right? So they've got stuff like that.
So let me ask you, one of the things I've seen with platforms like this is that because the diversity of problems that you're helping customers solve so frequently is that there's actually it's difficult to call it a software company because it can almost be called a consultancy that has a competitive advantage of having the Foundry tool available to them. So, taking any given new business client example, one of the things I'm hoping to understand is how many people from the Palantir team are helping the customer solve that problem. And in many cases, is your team better off just using Foundry themselves to help the customer get to the problem as opposed to the customer using its own staff to get to the answer to the problem themselves?
Yes, totally this sort of notion of like service versus product company, right, is the classic framing. And I'd say, like, certainly, over the time I was there, the ratio changed a lot. Like, and in Foundry in particular, right? I think like I was around when it was like first being developed, right? It wasn't even called Foundry. It was really sort of fledgling thing. And by the time I left, and certainly, if you sort of extrapolate at a reasonable rate since my departure, like it's like way more usable in a sense that like you don't need to be a Silicon Valley software, Stanford computer science grad to like make the thing hum. And as I say, it's broadened the tone, and they aspire to have users everywhere from like the hardcore data engineer to like the SQL guy who likes that. So like, I'm pretty good at Excel, but I'm not like a data engineer that says, like I just want to look at dashboards. Like they've built out the platform so all of these users can come and engage in the platform.
I think it would be helpful to understand. So you worked on energy, but which non-government vertical has it been the most popular with? Auto, social media, which non-government because you do government versus non-government. I'm asking, within the non-government area, what industry vertical has it been the most successful with so far?
Gosh. I mean, again, I think I have to be a little bit careful about what's appropriate to share. And by the way, my information is like a few years out of date. But I would say that like when it works well, like you can get it set up, and it can help any sort of Fortune 500 company, whatever, like they benefit from it. I think like what's often missed as, it sort of relates to your previous question around like service versus product. I think like what you find in, or what I learned and what is sort of, actually, at the center of some of the design principles behind Foundry is the sort of virtuous cycle that you can set up. Like if you can get Foundry to be the sort of the easiest place to get at your data and like do analysis and make decisions, then like the next time there's a data set, you're like, oh, so let's get in Foundry because we want to connect you to all the things you're already connected, right? You get this like very strong network. You can get a very strong positive feedback, like network effect going, where the more people that use it, the more valuable wallet is, and so the more people use it. And so part of like getting Palantir to work on the thing, right, or when you think about like the services component of it, there's a piece of it, which is just like get to critical mass, right? Like if you can get enough critical mass going, then enough users will start using it, and you'll get a positive feedback loop and it will work out well, right? Versus, I mean Palantir is not the only software that has this property, right? Like sometimes, if you get some of the amazing product, but if they are not totally shared usage or if they don't immediately find value from it, even if they would eventually, they don't get over the like activation energy, right? So I think that's something to be said. Like no matter how purely productized Foundry becomes, right, and sort of making a ton of progress, there is like this sort of chicken and egg thing that right at the beginning, where you need to get enough interesting stuff into it, that it's valuable enough that people will start pulling more and more stuff into it.
Yes. One other customer positioning question. I like using Facebook as the example because they build most of their own tools, and they have the largest user graph in the entire world and likely have their own versions of both Gotham and Foundry products within their own business. Where do you see that cutoff happening? I mean, I'd be surprised. I mean, maybe they are, but whether or not companies like Facebook and Google are customers. But is there like an employee count threshold? So I'm going to ask the question on two extremes, which is there an employee count size above which the company is developing its own technology? And on the smaller side, is there a level at which a company has to get to where it actually makes sense to be able to start using tools like this?
Yes. Great question. I mean, I think I've got an answer, but to make sure interesting framing. I think on the hindsight, I don't think it's employee count. I think it's like a technical confidence thing, right? And I think, yes, like Facebook, Google, Amazon, I mean the tech majors, they can be like, yes, let's like throw a few hundred engineers at this. Why not, right? And then like make something that's pretty awesome. In fact, an example, Airbnb, they famously developed an open source product called Airflow, which is particularly good at sort of this orchestrating very complicated data pipelines, which is like part of what Foundry does, right? So Foundry aspires to do more than that. So I think like they're really big guys like, yes, maybe they can sort of build the stuff out themselves or similar things if you get what they need. But even a modest step down from that, it would be hard to build your own. I think you're more likely to cobble together capabilities from multiple different pieces of software. It's probably like the way that the next teardown would do it, or frankly, even with Facebook or something, right? They would be more inclined to like, let's stitch together this open source stuff going forward. On the small side, that's probably fuzzier or definitely fuzzier, and it probably changes over time. I think there is no sort of bottom limit in terms of utility. Like, I guess, like if I was like starting a startup and I could afford Foundry, it'd be like, yes, actually, I might use it. Maybe I would, right? I think it's probably more valuable. I think, for sort of very large organizations that have this sort of like incredible complexity to manage. But certainly, in terms of like, if you look at sort of the clients of Palantir that are public, right? They're all big, right? You can't go to palantir.com right now and just like buy Foundry.
Yes, buy something. Yes.
Or start a Foundry. Yes, so maybe there's signal in that they decided that going for the sort of medium market is not the most useful focus yet.
Yes. On the government side, just calling the government customer is very misleading. There's federal, there's state, there's local. And within federal, you have all these hybrid private and public organizations. Do you have a perspective on how penetrated you feel the business is across the different ways that you might cut governmental organizations?
That's another good question. I will sort of clarify one thing, by the way, right? Like I've been using Gotham and government as synonyms. But I think that's just mostly because Gotham is almost exclusively sold to governments, and there's this slight investigatory flow that we talk about. I think there's no reason why you couldn't sell Foundry into governments as well, right? And I think there are some public instances where that has happened, right? And it's just more about the use case, right? If you have this kind of like massive data integration problem, then you can sort of Foundry, right? And if you've got like a bunch of investigators that are like it's super important to give them like an Iron Man suit, Gotham. And you can have them both, you can have them work together, right? So I should probably I want to clarify that a little bit, right? Gotham is almost exclusively government, but government doesn't have to be just Gotham. And then in terms of penetration, I mean just in the US, right? And just the federal government. Man, they spend a lot on technology. And then there's state governments, and there's municipal governments. And the US is not the only country in the world. So I'm not going to put a percentage on it, but there's a lot of headroom, I'd say, in government.
Yes. Cool. Well, I'll tell you what, I think we've covered a lot of my initial questions, and there's more work that I can do of studying.